Greetings, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming to addressing to our topic today, addressing discrimination in the Asian diaspora. A terrific crowd, and we appreciate that you're here and able to share time this morning and afternoon. And I think it was 56 degrees this morning, kind of unheard of in December. Anyway, we know these last 2 weeks too have been especially difficult. So your time today is so appreciated. And we hope the conversation helps in the overall effort for increasing awareness and understanding. And on a very positive note, it is such a pleasure and privilege to connect with teachers and experts in the field for these workshops. Your insights and our speakers always make for an incredibly dynamic time. And it also helps keep us all current with the best way to transfer and share knowledge and experience. And of course, we realize each time we set this up, we want to cover as much as possible, but we have learned an important concept, or keep trying to learn it, that the futility of teaching and learning everything, you can't. So our goal today is really twofold. One, to provide rich content on China, Japan, and Korea that will broaden curriculum perspectives, and to create new ways for making a socio-emotional space in the classroom. So the morning portion is informational. It'll be on Asian history and Asian American history. And the afternoon is empathy-based. That'll be on self-reflection and how to open up the classroom for discussion on diversity. And this workshop is really meant to be an intervention, if you will, a stepping stone to lengthier and more conversations down the road. So our morning portion will be recorded, but not the afternoon. And we hope maybe you've had a chance in your busy week to look at some of the articles that we included on the teacher letters to you on discrimination. And if not, that's fine. We'll build on what you have, and it'll be there for afterwards. So quickly, before introducing our speakers who've given up their Saturday, and we thank them so much for their time too, quick intros to the outreach team. All of us have training in area studies and speak the language of our respective centers and got our own unique talents and experiences. So from the NAM Center for Korean Studies, I'd like to introduce Kate Klemm-Szeto. And from the Center for Japanese Studies, we have Robin Griffin and Jillian Locke, and myself, Carol Stepanchuk, from the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. We have a special guest who I don't think is here right now, but we'll introduce her later on. So Jillian, would you like to give some remarks about just housekeeping and general intros? Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carol. And thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. As Carol said, I'm just going to introduce a few more things before we get started. So today we're looking at the topic of discrimination in the diaspora through the lens of history, literature, and the social sciences. We'll have 3 different approaches to capture highlights from China, Japan, and Korea with Dr. Yanshuo Zhang, Dr. Mika Kennedy, and Dr. Angela Yoonjeong McClean. So during the lectures, we ask that you please keep your camera off and microphone muted. And during the Q&A and the afternoon sessions, it's preferred that you turn your camera and microphone on when you want to speak. As a thank you for participating today, and to help further your study of this topic, each of your school libraries or media centers will receive a 2-year subscription to Education About East Asia. And attendees will also receive their own personal copies of the 5 books that we listed in our emails previously. And although today's workshop does not include sketch credit, we will provide, upon request, a certificate for professional development that tells of your participation in this workshop, which you may provide to your supervisors or principals. And each of you will also receive a Google Drive link to a plethora of teaching resources, including book lists, websites, museums, media sources, and more to continue your own individual study. And lastly, we'll also send out an anonymous evaluation form at the end of today's workshop. All right, so now I'd like to return the mic to Carol.
Okay, great. So to set the stage for these mini lectures, we have a very short PowerPoint, just a few slides, but we want to first mention that there's huge diversity in this topic and what we're sharing, diversity of East Asia with China, Japan, and Korea. Of course, regional variation within each country that's constantly in flux, and the diversity of Asian American groups within the US. So now with the PowerPoint, we just want to start with the first slide. What is Asian Americans? And this is a term that really arises out of the surge of activism in the 1960s. And it encompasses a huge group, right? 20 ethnic groups and nationalities. And students and activists in the 60s were inspired by a number of factors, right? Opposition to the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, Black Power, and connected multiple Asian immigrant communities for the shared identity. And the goals were multifold and included efforts to alleviate poverty, to eliminate stereotypes and marginalization. And the movement called attention to, and these are just some, Japanese internment, harassment driven by McCarthyism, and the discrimination that came from being seen as not American. And so there's another footnote to this too, that the term is coined a few years after the Immigration and Naturalization Act, 1965. And what that did was it eliminated the quota system by country of origin and instead went for categories. So workers, professionals, and most importantly, families. So there's this huge boom in Asian families. So the next slide, how big is the Asian American umbrella and how complicated is it? So this is an excerpt from a really interesting book, Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen by Jose Vargas, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And he was trying as a young teenager to understand who he was and how he fit in. So he says, when it came to the subject of race, my 14-year-old immigrant brain couldn't process it. I knew I was Filipino, that much was clear, but I didn't realize I was Asian or that Chinese and Korean and Indian people were Asian too. And because I was Filipino, I was both Asian and a Pacific Islander. There were people labeled Asian for geographic reasons because we came from the Asian continent. But if it's about geography, shouldn't Hispanic and Latino people be called Americans? And whenever I read anything about race, why are Asian and Hispanic capitalized while Black and white are not? Where do you go if you're multiracial and multi-ethnic? So this book was distributed at the International Institute. We had Jose Vargas as a guest speaker, and it really defines this notion of homelessness, not in the traditional sense, but in terms of undocumented immigrants. So what's the most coveted prize for immigrants short of citizenship? It's the green card. And this slide here is an artistic rendering by the artist Hung Liu. And it's an image of her interpretation of the green card. It's actually billboard size, and it hangs in San Francisco's De Young Museum, part of a bigger exhibit. So the green card's only good for 10 years. You can get conditional green cards for 2 years, but her artistic commentary on this is it really speaks to the fragility of the status as an immigrant. And you can see the name Cookie, Fortune Cookie. Cookie was a slang term for women in the mid 20th century. And of course, Fortune Cookie, this is sort of a stereotype of the restaurant industry. So the next slide, the next couple of words, look at movement beyond and out of country over there. And this is associated with immigrant populations. So we have the word in our title, diaspora and migration. And diaspora refers to a population that shares a common heritage and scattered throughout different parts of the world. Migration refers to groups of people moving in search of settlement, more of a reflection of economic, social, and environmental change. And there are nuances to these terms, and our speakers will probably touch on those aspects. And the last two words that we have Next slide is race and ethnicity. So in the US, race is commonly associated with the way we look, visible phenotypes, whereas ethnicity is based on distinguishable cultural traits. And these are malleable terms too, changing across time and space. So what we wanted to do with these words is just set a backdrop to the talks that are now the focus of our morning program. So I'm delighted to start off our talks and introduce our first speaker, Yanshuo Zhang. She is a postdoc at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, and her work explores and researches multi-ethnic Chinese identities in both China and the US. She received her PhD from Stanford in East Asian languages and cultures, and she's currently teaching a class to undergraduates on ethnic and cultural diversity in China. Her office is right next to mine, so I get to interface with her frequently and learn about all sorts of things, including really cool ethnic art projects in China's Western regions. So please help me welcome Dr. Zhang.
Well, thank you, Carol, Kate, Robin, Jillian, and all our conference organizers. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning. And thank you for all the friends and colleagues who have signed in to our meeting today. I know some of you have signed in from China, actually. So thank you for being here and sharing this time. It is my great pleasure to share a part of my research with you with regard to the experience of Chinese students, Chinese international students in the US and the history of US-China relations through the angle of education. So with that, let me start sharing my screen. Okay, can you guys see my screen okay? PowerPoint slides okay? All right, great. So the title of my presentation is Fostering Cultural Diversity in the Classroom Through Understanding US-China Educational Exchange History. And before I start, I would like to tell you why I was interested in pursuing this topic for this particular workshop. So as Carol said, I received my PhD at Stanford University back in 2018. But before that, I actually came to the US as an undergraduate international student as early as 2006. So it's been a wonderful and wondrous journey of crossing over the national boundaries, cultural boundaries, and become the scholar that I am today. So as I was an international student in the past, I always thought about the challenges, hopes, and promises that international students, particularly international students from China and Asia, are facing here in the US. So with that, I would like to take you back to 100 years ago at the first moment of US-China educational exchange. So in the year 1871, China's last imperial government, called the Qing government, initiated a Chinese educational mission in the hope of strengthening China, because at the time, China was faced with a lot of international cultural and economic exchange with the West, many times, forced into the increasingly globalized world order without realizing the cultural and economic dynamics behind those newly established world orders. So in the hope of strengthening China and modernizing China, the Chinese government back in the late 19th century initiated this educational mission. And in 1871, they sent the first group of Chinese young boys named the Youtong, the American educated youngsters, to America. And this educational mission resulted from this important Burlingame-Seward Treaty of 1868 between the US and China. Some of you might know that back then, China was actually signing a lot of treaties with Western countries. But this one particular treaty was probably one of the first relatively equal treaties between China and the US. And here the point is that through this educational exchange, China and its educational system was able to renew itself by adding a Western liberal and technological dimension to the traditional Confucian cultural structure and curricula in China. Because for over 2 millennia, if you were a school kid in China, you would only study Confucian classics and poetry, and you wouldn't necessarily study math, STEM fields, or Western culture, right? So this was a very important moment of China's encounter with Western educational system. And again, there was this important agenda of modernizing and industrializing China by sending its young students to study primarily in America and to gain those technological skills and industrial skills to contribute to China's modernization. And here we have this historical photograph from the Chinese Educational Commission connection. And as we can see, this is a group of young Chinese boys dressed up in their traditional Chinese garments. And a lot of them were actually sent to the US at a relatively young age. And they went to elementary school, secondary school, and eventually many of them went on to study at premier US higher education institutions, such as MIT, Yale, Harvard, and so on and so forth. So many of those students went back to China and they helped build the first Chinese railroad, and they helped contribute to the establishment of modern industries like mining and other industrial efforts, again, with the hope of strengthening China and making it an industrialized country. And this trend of US-China educational relation continued well into the first half of the 20th century. And one important aspect is that beyond STEM fields, there were actually a lot of Chinese intellectuals, Chinese students who came here to study in America in the fields of arts, culture, and literature. So when I was a student back in China, when I was a high school student, I was tremendously inspired by the three figures listed here on this slide. So shown here in the middle is Dr. Hu Shi, who studied at Cornell University, and he received his degree, PhD degree at Cornell, and he studied under Professor Zhang Dui, who was a famous American philosopher at the time. And after Dr. Hu Shi returned to China, he was an advocate for modernizing not only Chinese technology, but also culture. So Dr. Hu Shi was a strong advocate for vernacularizing the Chinese language in order to spread literacy in China. And he was also a prolific writer and educator. And under his advocacy, a lot of Western literature, culture, and thought was introduced into China. And beyond Dr. Hu Shi, we have here Ms. Lin Huiying, shown on the right, and Mr. Liang Sichen. They were actually a couple and probably one of the most famous academic couples in 20th century China. So both of them studied at the University of Pennsylvania, and they were experts in Chinese art and architecture. So after Mr. Liang Sichen and Ms. Lin Huiying went back to China, they helped establish the Chinese Architectural Society to document and preserve Chinese architectural heritage. And that was a very important endeavor, especially at the time of the Sino-Japanese War in the 1930s and 40s. With those Chinese intellectuals pushing for the documentation and preservation of Chinese culture, there became a strong wave of cherishing Chinese cultural heritage. And as we can see, those American educated intellectuals were champions of valuing and passing down Chinese cultural heritage to students and to the broader society. And those figures all had tremendous influence on Chinese culture and society in the 20th century and onwards. With that historical perspective, now let's take a look at how that long and rich history of US-China cultural exchange history has continued to our day and era, right? So here I have a chart from statistica.com. As we can see from this chart, between the year 2010 and 2019, the number of Chinese international students studying in US colleges and universities actually doubled during the course of 10 years. And it reached its pinnacle like right before COVID hit us in 2020, right? So statistically speaking, Chinese students are probably the number one or the largest group of international students studying in the US nowadays, making up for approximately 35% of the entire international student population in US higher education nowadays. And not only do Chinese students find America an attractive destination for study, but the reverse is true, right? So the white paper by the International Institute of Education indicates that the number of American students studying abroad in China also increased by over 500% in the past decade or so, making China one of the top 10 study abroad destination countries for American students. So we can see that the attraction is mutual, and this mutual educational and cultural exchange between the US and China has been tremendously influential for both countries in terms of establishing further cultural ties and helping to further educational and social reforms in both countries. And this trend only started to dip since the onset of the COVID pandemic earlier last year. And this leads us to the challenges that some Chinese students are facing in the US. And so here in the second part of my presentation, I will focus more on the challenges and strategies that we can use in the classroom as teachers nowadays are facing more and more Chinese international students in their classrooms, right? So as we can see, even before the COVID, English language and cultural differences were probably one of the most severe challenges faced by Chinese and other Asian international students. And this is understandable because for a lot of East Asian students, English was not the language that they grew up speaking. And unless you go to an international school or American school, chances are that your arrival in the US would be your first moment of living in an English immersion experience as an Asian student, right? So that linguistic and cultural challenge presents itself as probably one of the most severe challenges faced by Chinese and other East Asian international students. And in addition to that, COVID has induced a lot more discrimination and challenges faced by Chinese and other Asian students nowadays. As we all know, up until recently, there were a lot of international travel bans and restrictions. And as a result, a lot of Chinese students could not enter the US. But fortunately, this trend has been reversed and a lot of travel bans have been uplifted, which has allowed a new wave of Chinese students entering the US starting this fall. So that is a good new development. But beyond that, we also see that there has been a trend of attributing the sort of attributing COVID to this Asian presence or Chineseness, because China is perceived to be the country of origin of COVID. So we've all heard of a lot of unfortunate incidences taking place in various American cities when Chinese people or Asian people were targeted as, hostile social sentiments resulting from this anxiety that was induced by COVID. So beyond that, we also have this more long-term anxiety, I think, that's faced by Chinese and other East Asian students, which I think will go beyond COVID, and that is the career choice faced by our international students nowadays. So a lot of Asian students still, for example, choose STEM fields, the science, technology, and math as their fields of study, mostly probably due to parental and peer pressure, and also a perception that STEM fields can promise more profitability in students' future career choices. However, in my own teaching experience at various institutions here in America, I've also come into contact with an increasing wave of Asian students who are passionate about arts, languages, literatures, or non-STEM fields, right? So how do we as educators encourage students to faithfully pursue their personal passion, but also with an eye to the sort of career development and professional development aspect of their major or academic choices in school? So I think that's something that we as educators need to grapple with for the foreseeable future. And with that, I would like to offer some maybe practical thoughts and tips that we can use in the classroom when educators are faced with Chinese and international students. So what do those students want and what are their desires and hopes despite all the drawbacks and challenges that they might be facing? So I'm actually here showing you a picture that I took back in October of this year. I had a research trip to the East Coast and I visited this museum called the Peabody Essex Museum located in Massachusetts. The Peabody Essex Museum, some of you might know that has transplanted a piece of Chinese architecture from China's southern Anhui province all the way to this New England museum. And on a sunny Sunday morning, I encountered this group of Chinese students who were studying at a local university in the larger Boston area. And as you can see, those students were dressed up in the traditional Chinese costume or hanfu. That's like a newly imagined sort of revival of traditional Chinese costume. And those students were having a research field trip in the museum. They were interacting with the Chinese cultural elements in the museum. And when I interviewed a couple of students there, they were telling me that one student said, I feel proud and I feel a strong sense of cultural confidence whenever I wear my hanfu or traditional garment. And other students in my previous teaching experiences at Stanford and the University of San Francisco have told me that because in the past I have taught Chinese literature and cultural courses, so I've always heard of Chinese students telling me that it was only after coming to the US that they start to truly cherish their Chinese cultural background. And that's why they decided to enroll in my classes and study more about Chinese culture, tradition, and history. So I think this is a very important point for educators to take away, which is that counterintuitively, in addition to their need to master the English language and to maybe assimilate into the American cultural and social world, Chinese students do feel a strong urge to keep in contact with their Chinese cultural heritage in the US. And this desire of keeping in touch with one's native culture or home culture, I think can be used as a very empowering trope in our teaching and in our interactions with students. And with that, I would like to introduce you guys to the concept of cultural rhetorics, which was a concept that I learned during my teaching experience in the program in Writing and Rhetoric at Stanford University. So in the program in Writing and Rhetoric, I routinely, taught and mentored students from diverse cultural backgrounds. And I really found it helpful to use the concept of cultural rhetorics, which is the concept of not just respecting students' diverse cultural backgrounds, but to actively encouraging students to use their cultural expertise to contribute to their general education. And this idea of cultural rhetorics ties well with this other concept of rhetorical sovereignty. So the idea of rhetorical sovereignty was developed by scholars of Native American studies here in the US. And rhetorical sovereignty refers to the fact that every student or person deserves to have discourses, voices, and rights to assert and articulate their cultural backgrounds and their ideas into the larger area of their life. Right, so you might encounter a student who's not entirely fluent in English, but then nevertheless, with their own linguistic and cultural sensibilities, they're eager to express their ideas in the classroom. So teachers need to be patient with students as they wade through the initial linguistic challenges to find their way and their expressive power by bringing their home cultures into their general education. And as teachers, we need to respect and cultivate those rhetorical sovereignties because they relate strongly to students' sense of self and sense of community. Because sovereignty, of course, has this idea of taking ownership of one's culture and one's heritage, right? So that sense of ownership is very empowering and generative to our students' education. And with that, I asked that teachers to understand and nurture students' cultural heritage. At the beginning of the semester or school year, you could design a brief survey to ask your students about their cultural heritage, their home cultures, their motives, dreams, and concerns. Usually, you don't have to share that survey result with everybody else in the class. You could just read it yourself. But in my past teaching experience, I find it to be very important for students to feel that like they have a voice at the very beginning of the semester or as they enter into a new level of studying. And as the semester continues, I think some other strategies that can be used by our teachers is that you could proactively encourage students to speak about their cultural backgrounds and demonstrate their cultural expertise in various kinds of class discussions and assignments. Right, so what I do in my own teaching is that I design a lot of interactive components in my courses, right? For example, I always have this thing that I call a research gallery, in which students post blogs about a particular project. Usually it's a project that the whole class is working on, but instead of asking students to work on those projects individually, you could foster a collective sense of belonging by asking students to post some of the findings and ideas that they have gleaned for their projects. Usually, I think an online teaching platform would be conducive to that kind of effort. And then you could also ask students to comment on each other's projects and offer feedback and ideas to each other's projects. And I think through this kind of exercise, students gain a strong sense of not just being a passive receiver of knowledge, but an active contributor and producer of knowledge. And by working with their classmates, they also have fun, they foster solidarity and friendship through the process of group projects. And then I think the whole idea behind this kind of creative project is that you can also experiment with other formats such as art exhibitions, team presentations, and a host of other creative projects. Through this process, I think the idea is that teachers would need to find pedagogical carriers of cultural identity for our students. So in other words, culture is not just an empty signifier, it's not just an empty symbol or mark that people carry. But once, as educators, we help our students find those tangible carriers and external manifestations of culture, then students will feel a stronger sense of belonging in the classroom. And that will foster a sense of pride and a sense of happiness, I think, to our students' general well-being. So in conclusion, I hope through my discussion of the US-China educational exchange history and through offering some practical guidelines, we can continue to think about the question of how do we foster cultural diversity in the classroom through understanding students' cultural backgrounds and through understanding the larger intercultural pictures of US, China, and US international educational landscape. So I look forward to the discussions and responses that you guys might have. And thank you so much for listening in.
Oh, thank you so much for that really stimulating talk and interesting statistics and great ideas for the classroom. I'd like to let our teachers know that please, you can unmute yourselves and ask questions to Yanshuo Zhang. If anyone has them, please unmute, and I've got some, I'll give you all a minute, and maybe I'll ask you this one question to actually about international students, and this is to our teachers as well, and in middle and high school. I know that, for example, at Pioneer, there's a number of international students and a greater number coming for high school experience before applying to higher ed, before applying to colleges and universities. And so I'm just kind of throwing this out to the teachers too. I wonder how many of you are dealing with international students in that kind of position. And Dr. Zhang, do you have statistics on the number of international students in middle and high school that are coming from China for that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question, Carol. So I don't have statistics offhand about the number of Chinese students in elementary or secondary school levels here in the US, but my sense is that there's an increasing number of younger students who come to the US, right? So in the past, like in the 80s and 90s, it was almost always graduate students from China who came to the US, right? And then kind of in my generation, I came to the US in the mid 2000s, like in 2006. So that was probably the first wave of a major wave of undergraduate students coming from China. And now we see more and more undergraduate students, but also younger students who come to the US before they enter college. And then I think maybe that's a really important question, because how do we help those younger students to reconcile and grapple with their multiple cultural perspectives, because they are at a rapid age of understanding the world around them. And then how do we help them with those multicultural landscapes and multi-ethnic communities that they're plugged in here in the US? Yeah, maybe some of our teachers here can share some experiences or ideas too.
So if you do have some ideas and experience in that, please unmute yourselves and let us know. I mean, this gives all sorts of ideas too for outreach efforts that we can do in connecting with middle and high schools too, and various cultural events and just ways of building community. I'm just gonna,
Hi, my name
Darby.
is Darby. I'll just share a little bit of experience. I teach in Oakland, Merritt College, and I mostly taught in person. I've taught at a lot of other places too, but I've been teaching online the last 2 years. And I mostly teach Asian and Asian American film the last few years. And so I have a lot of Asian immigrant students, Asians in the diaspora. And I do notice that, yeah, definitely language is a big thing. I always do a survey in the beginning that's open to the whole class discussion, and I preface it by saying that we're trying to become comfortable with a classroom discussion and try to build a sense of community. And that one way to do this is to try to get to know each other better and try to help others know more about us, right? So put a human, with the stories, which is partly what you're doing here, what Yanshuo just did also. You give the examples, right? That from humans, and that humanizes it. It's not just facts for facts' sake, but with a human connection to humanize it. And I find about over half of my students are of Chinese descent, and probably a little over half of those ones are from China. And then the other big group of Asian American and Asian students I get are like Southeast Asian, Vietnamese, Laotian, Cambodian. And one of the challenges I have is a pretty big difference in some of their socioeconomic and educational backgrounds in the classroom. So I'm constantly kind of juggling linguistic skills with kind of general educational backgrounds, right? So I find that for evaluating, if I can give them the benefit of the doubt and try to evaluate in a very holistic way, that helps a lot, So sometimes they don't really answer the prompt like literally or exactly, but I'm trying to figure out what are they thinking and what have they actually done. And if I can see they actually applied themselves, then I'll overlook the language difference. Or maybe I give them the benefit of the doubt and realize, well, maybe they interpreted the prompt differently than what I meant, but as long as they did something that shows that, they were trying to do something, I'll still give them credit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, Darby. Thank you for sharing about that. I think that loops back to the question of rhetoric, right? Because a lot of the sort of questions and teaching strategies we adopt in the classroom might stem from a Western rhetorical perspective. But Asian cultures sometimes have a very different rhetorical stance, right? Sometimes, for example, Asian students will feel more intimidated about challenging their teachers or having an open conversation with their teachers because it's kind of conventional in the Confucian culture to defer to the authority, right? So how do we even open students up to having an open conversation with their teachers, with their classmates about things? So yeah, and I think it's great that you share about your wonderful efforts of understanding from students' perspective how they might have interpreted your prompts and your rhetorical strategies per se. So I think that's that great mutual respect and understanding your students from their cultural backgrounds and perspectives, I think would be a very important strategy for teachers to take away with. Yeah.
That's great. I see that Angela McClean has her hand raised. Angela, you can unmute, and thank you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I myself learned a lot about not just US-China student exchange history, but also Chinese international students and how we can better guide them through our teaching. My question is about maybe perhaps in your experience and other teachers' experiences, if they have found sort of difference between how international students versus second generation Asian American students or 1.5 generation Asian American students interact with their peers and their teachers in a classroom, because obviously, although they're all grouped as Asian Americans, they have a very different kind of background and history, and perhaps even like second generation or even 1.5 generation students don't really have language barriers, right? Because they were either born here or raised here. And I see some conflict between, even if we all like altogether group them as Asian Americans, there's a big difference between the two groups. And so Yanshuo, you talked mainly about addressing approaching international students, but I wonder if the same goes towards same kind of teaching method goes towards the 1.5 or second gen.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. That's a wonderful question and a very good reflection on the topic of fostering diversity in the classroom. And I think it's like related in a way, right, to the discussion of international students. Maybe I could speak a little bit about my experience. So yeah, I think through my past teaching experience, second generation Asian American students or 1.5 generation students, linguistic barriers are no longer a problem for them. But I think a lot of them are still trying to grapple with, for example, how they would incorporate their Asian heritage into their American identity, right? So I think that's probably another set of challenges that we're talking about. It's similar to international student struggles, but in a very different way, right? So for example, in the past, I actually had a Korean American student who said that she gave a wonderful presentation about how when she was a child, her mom was trying to speak Korean to her. She was a second generation student, and then she never took her language studies, Korean language studies seriously until when she learned about this little fable from Korean culture about this rebellious child, who always refuses to listen to his mom. And, it was a very profound story. I think at the end of the story, it goes like, so the mom was about to pass away, about to die. And then she told the son to bury her body in a certain location. And the rebellious son thought, oh, I have rebelled against my mother all my life. Now I'm going to grant her one last wish, right? But then the son misunderstood the Korean words in her mom's wishes. So as a result, he couldn't bury her mom in the location that her mom was asking for. So that student of mine, really told the story to, I think, drive home the idea that home language, home linguistics would still be important for second generation Asian American students, because without that linguistic understanding, you would be very detached from your home culture. And maybe I think some psychological studies also point out that the closer you feel to your home culture, the more confidence you would have in other aspects of your life, at least in the longer term. So yeah, I would still perhaps encourage teachers to connect with their second generation Asian students, Asian American students, and try to find that balance between, fostering their Asian cultural identity, but then also their American cultural identity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we have some questions in the chat. Carol, would you like to?
Yeah, actually, one from Mika first, Mika Kennedy. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious about kind of hearing about how your white identifying students have also sort of engaged with these ideas of cultural rhetoric in terms of not only kind of not understanding their experience as the norm against which things should be measured, but also thinking about their own kind of stories, right? Like for some context, I teach at a primarily white institution, but teaching Asian American studies have found that many of my white identifying students have realized they themselves had really kind of little knowledge of their own families' immigration stories and cultural histories. And we're able to realize that through kind of thinking through this lens.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Mika. Yeah, that's I think maybe it also loops back to some of the insights that Angela was offering. Yeah, I think maybe one strategy we could use for those so-called white identifying students would still be to ask reflective questions, right? Maybe you could design some assignments that don't have like a right or wrong answer, but that invite students to reflect on the question of identity. Or maybe try to investigate where that white identifying sentiment stems from, right? Is it stemming from a fear of exclusion from their communities, or from in my opinion, usually that kind of sentiment stems from a negative, like a fear or concern over their overall identity. So if as teachers, I think we could tap into that realm of fear or anxiety and turn it into an empowering trope. And then I think that would be probably productive. And we don't have to like avoid the struggles altogether, right? We can tap into that space of anxiety. Like, why do you think it's okay, for example, to ignore or overlook your Asian background? What gains do you have? What losses do you have in the process of giving up that home culture, right? Yeah, I think that maybe again, fostering that open space in the classroom so students can feel safe and they won't be judged for however they think and feel, but it's just a space for people to reflect. Because yeah, cultural identities do come in different shapes and degrees and colors, right? So we need to cherish all of those different colors and shapes and degrees of identity. So yeah, that would be my preliminary thought on your idea, but I would be happy to discuss more about it.
Thank you. We have actually another comment from one of the teachers, and Amanda Harper, and I'll read it. Please feel free to unmute as well. Amanda says, I teach middle school in an independent school in Ann Arbor. Over 20% of my students identify as Asian. There's a lot of diversity within this group in terms of culture, but also family experiences. Some students come from families where the parents have come to the US recently, and others several generations in the past. As a history teacher, I want to ensure my students see themselves in the curriculum, but I also want to support them as students overall. Yeah, that's a great comment and speaks to our conversation here.
I I don't have a question in that, I guess. I'm just looking for ideas to ensure that I'm doing what is best for them.
Thanks.
So I think that what you just had to say was helpful in thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. So I think, yeah, that it's really important that you brought up this issue of diversity within the so-called umbrella Asian term, right? Because as some of our other participants have pointed out, I think Darby pointed out earlier that even within the Asian umbrella term, you have different kinds of Asian groups or interracial, interethnic groups within Asian communities. So I think, yeah, I would still recommend, tapping into the cultural rhetoric strategy in terms of understanding, even some of the nuanced cultural differences among the different Asian cultures, right? And I think our organizers have a great list of readings for teachers to read, and then you can, I think, maybe assume like a student's perspective, and also ask your students, I'm not familiar with your culture, but how would you explain your culture to someone who has come to contact with it for the first time, or something like that. You could create games maybe in the classroom for students from different cultural backgrounds to interview each other, do like mini interviews, maybe at the first class, 5-minute interviews, interview a peer and write down a list of their cultural habits, cultural customs, and what are the cultural customs that you guys are still observing in your home right after your parents have migrated to the US, for example, so on and so forth. So I think creating that very personalized approach might be important for students to really feel, like I said earlier, a sense of pride and belonging in their culture. So it's not like the culture is just a symbol or some book knowledge, but it's something that they can feel and they can talk about on a regular basis. And if they feel that that's a relevant part of their education, then they would feel more inclined to identify with their culture. So yeah, that would be my take on it.
Thank you so much. You made this very palpable, and the notion of really feeling culture is terrific. We're at a point now where we can take a 5-minute break, and
okay, so we have reached the top of the hour, 11 o'clock. So I think we're going to go ahead and come back from our break. Thank you again, Dr. Zhang, for just starting us off and really just priming a lot of the topics that we hope to go into more depth within the discussion this afternoon. So thank you so much for getting us started. It's also my sincere pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is Professor Mika Kennedy here. Professor Kennedy is a visiting assistant professor of English at Kalamazoo College. She's also a University of Michigan alum with a PhD in philosophy, English language, and literature. And her research also examines narratives of Japanese American incarceration, as well as environmental humanities, American literature, and critical ethnic studies. She's also the curator of Exile to Motown, Japanese Americans in Detroit, which is an interactive traveling exhibit of exclusive oral histories, archival photos, and documents that tell a crucial part of Detroit's history from a Japanese American perspective. She was also one of our guests this summer for a series of webinars and podcasts on Japanese studies and anti-racist pedagogy, and we're just so happy to have her back with us today. And so please, everyone join me in giving me a warm welcome to Professor Mika Kennedy. So whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Robin, for that wonderful introduction. It was really great to be a participant with the Center for Japanese Studies anti-racist pedagogy workshop last year, and excellent to be back. I'm going to go ahead and load up these slides, make sure that looks good to everyone. But for this, oh, yes.
Looks great.
Okay, cool. For this presentation, I really wanted to focus on thinking through the title of the overall workshop in terms of addressing discrimination in the Asian diaspora, and thinking about where is discrimination rooted and how can we cultivate alternatives. And so I wanted to start off by opening up our perspectives in terms of kind of this question around immigration to the United States by talking a little bit about two museums. that I have had the pleasure of visiting a couple of times. So the two museums are the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, California, and the Museum of Overseas Migration in Yokohama, Japan. And my first visit to JANM in Los Angeles was as part of a Japantown internship that was really focused on thinking about the place of Japanese America in the United States and these Japantowns. And my first encounter with the Museum of Overseas Migration was part of a student cultural exchange program through the Japanese government that was interested in connecting kind of diasporic youth to Japan. And I thought it was an interesting way of doing that in terms of visiting this museum that was kind of that diasporic population's own history presented from the perspective of Japan rather than the countries of not the country of origin, but the opposite of that. It's Saturday. But I think what this highlights is kind of the work that is available in simply pointing out that multiplicity of perspective, the possibility of multiple perspectives, and where we might go in terms of thinking through that multiplicity. And I think this came up a little bit in the Q&A for Yanshuo, as well as something that Angela will also be talking a little bit more about. But even just thinking about it from a perspective of immigration and emigration, and these 2 points of view in terms of this kind of singular movement, I guess. And I think what we get out of that is, one, this reminder that overseas migration, for instance, to use the language of the museum's title, is not limited only to the United States. And so that diaspora was also going to Mexico, to Brazil, to Peru, to all these other countries, which helps kind of destabilize this notion of this US exceptionalism, where it's the only place anyone would ever want to migrate to or to go to, which I think is often the root of a lot of perceptions of immigrant invasions, perceptions of resource scarcity, because everyone wants to come to the US. So even the reminder that there are other sites to which people emigrate is already kind of disrupting that idea. And before I move on, I also wanted to note that JANM has virtual visits that you can schedule for your classroom, and they're grant funded and so free to the classrooms, which might be an interesting thing to bring up. That's why there's a frog in that screenshot. It's part of their virtual visit. Every time we try and switch slides, it doesn't work. Okay. And so this is a map from the Museum of Overseas Migration. And it's a three-dimensional representation of the different prefectures from which Japanese nationals emigrated. And I really like this display because of a couple of reasons, but one, it places this emphasis on not only the destination, but also the places being left, and kind of names them as real places and not just an ether from which people are coming from. It also asks this question about these different points of origin and potentially the multiple and different reasons that one might leave or choose to migrate, or perhaps be forced to migrate. And so you see here the major point of immigration in this map for 109,893 people is the prefecture of Hiroshima. The second largest is actually the island of Okinawa, which is not pictured on this map, but is a southern island of Japan that I'll talk about a little bit later. And I think it's important to linger on this notion because, to the best of my knowledge, there is no similar museum for the United States. There's no Museum of Overseas Migration from the United States. And that reflects a couple of things. One, kind of a legitimate different political history in terms of the United States as a country, but also asks us to think about what that history is and how it shapes the United States' relationship to those who may be arriving to its borders. And again, to repeat, thinking about the ways that that frames these fears of invasion, of resource scarcity, and perhaps a threat to notions of cultural purity or Americanness. And thinking about those threats, I wanted to offer just a very brief historical overview of a couple hundred years of history, but to focus on two patterns when we're looking at these dates. One, the fact that most of these dates are all really focused on immigration, in particular its restriction and its exclusion, and the fact that these exclusions are racially and regionally explicit in these cases, as well as the fact that many of the so-called quote unquote wins in terms of immigration policy are often double-edged and can come at the expense of other populations. So if we look at this, we have in the middle of the 19th century, the end of Japanese isolation, and therefore the beginning of a period of migration elsewhere. The 1907 and 1924 acts are related to the limitation and or complete exclusion of immigrants from Japan and other places in Asia. 1942, an Executive Order 9066 is the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the Western coast during World War II. 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act is the point at which Japanese nationals became eligible for citizenship in the United States, which is not something that was previously available to that point, but also was an act that was looking to restrict those opportunities for non-Japanese populations. Similarly, 1965 is the Immigration Act that changed a lot of these quota systems in terms of immigration from various countries. Many of them were in the Asian continent, but was kind of restrictive to populations in other ways. If we're thinking about asylum seekers from the Caribbean and things like that. And so when we think about this opening of the United States to Asia and to Japan, we also want to think about the political power and economic power there is to be gained by that in terms of this kind of Cold War setting, in terms of wanting to have different political relationships with potential rising powers in Asia, for instance, and how that also shapes some of these recuperative moves in terms of how Asians were viewed in the United States. I also want to note that in addition to these histories of Japanese exclusion from the United States, there are also histories of empire and Japanese imperialism, which I think is important to note for the kind of contemporary history, because power is not exclusive to the United States in these relations, and there are many fresh wounds with regard to Japanese imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. And so to kind of mix up identities or see all Asians as the same can come with a lot of potentially damaging reactions. I say this as someone who grew up in a Asian majority city in California, where there were many classmates who had parents who were in the United States because of the after effects of Japanese imperialism, and still thought very intimately about that history. And so one of the books that I offered to the workshop as a potential reading material for educators is In Search of Our Frontiers, which is really thinking about the interweaving of exclusion and imperial designs from Japan, and the way the United States' exclusion of Japanese people also then shaped the Japanese policy in their invasions of Manchuria and Korea. So I wanted to quickly shift gears here and talk a little bit about immigrant identity in the word Nikkei, which is the Japanese word for someone of Japanese descent who is a non-citizen, but has that lineage. So the first character is just the first character for the Japanese word for Japan. And the second character denotes kind of this thread or this tie or this lineage. And the column on the right is a number of different ways that people who are part of this diasporic community might identify. And I'm not going to get into the specificities of all of those right now, except to name that there are these multiple potential ways to identify and ways of articulating one's relationship to a national identity or an ethnic community that are both a personal choice, but are also shaped by this range of potential experiences and influences. Then I wanted to quickly talk about in the context of Michigan, the state of Michigan, and the number of ways that Japanese people have come to also be Michiganders from the turn of the century in the late 19th century for the automotive industry, the burgeoning kind of Ford boom that has shaped Southeast Michigan so much, as well as resettlement during and after World War II, coming for school, for agriculture, for again, the automotive industry, and coming in the more recent decades, again, for the automotive industry, but also for reasons of other kind of business opportunities, of diplomacy, and the ways that all of these different potentials and these different kind of temporal entry points shape that experience, as well as the ways that the communities one is entering into are also intimately shaping these experiences in terms of Metro Detroit and its broader racial histories, its kind of stark delineations between a Black-white color line and how that shapes understandings of race in the area and continues to do so to this day. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of that right now, though I'd be happy to talk about them in the Q&A in terms of Midwest resettlement for Japanese Americans and in terms of the murder of Vincent Chin as a flashpoint for Pan-Asian solidarity in the Midwest. I also wanted to kind of foreground this idea that migratory flows are always in process, and the United States may not be the end point. There may be other countries to which people move. There may be regular circulation between, for instance, the United States and Japan, and the intention that one will not, in fact, settle in either one of these countries, but will continuously be back and forth between them, or even perhaps countries outside of the United States and Japan, for instance, Latin America or Europe, which is the different locations that feature in Jino Ishii's Foxdrum Bebop, a piece of fiction that I also mentioned in the potential texts related to this talk. And so as we finish, I wanted to talk a little bit about generational naming for Japanese Americans or Nikkei broadly, which is a fairly common way of identifying one's generation within the Japanese diaspora, similar to like saying like, oh, I'm a boomer, I'm Gen X, I'm a millennial, Gen Z. And these generations are Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, Gosei, etc. for first, second, third generation. And it is so much a part of that culture that one time I was on a bus talking to a fellow Japanese American and said that I was Gosei or fifth generation. And she immediately said, oh, picture bride? Because of that association with like which generation of immigration, which narrative is part of yours. And that was just a bus encounter. And this is important because in as much as it can be a shorthand for thinking about these different histories of immigration and identity, they also become important when pointing to one's generational history in the United States and what that is meant to mean. I wanted to bring up the concept of firsting, which is from Indigenous studies and is somewhat tongue-in-cheek in terms of naming the process of discovering land that is already being lived on and already populated by people, or doing something first that other people have already done. And thinking about this primacy in terms of establishing the long-rootedness of one's history in a country. So my colleague Sho on Twitter was reflecting on his identity as a fourth-generation Japanese American and says, if I call myself Yonsei or fourth generation, my identity is born of settlement. My understanding of self is legible or countable only when my ancestors become active participants in the colonization of the Americas. Ocean divides me from memory and becomes a site of negation, not power. And I wanted to highlight this tweet because in addition to being able to shorthand history, there is also this potential double edge, right? Where it becomes an opportunity to think about the ways that that naming convention may inadequately contend with the United States as stolen indigenous land. And the way that that naming convention has the potential to deny belonging to newcomers who have not been in the United States for as long, or perhaps are attempting to come to the United States. And that reminder, that focused awareness, can help disrupt these assumptions of otherness and who is deciding who is other. And so if we return to my initial question in terms of the roots of discrimination, I think they're manifold, but one way we might think about them is these 3 points in terms of this weaponization of difference in order to create this sense of peril, of invasion, of resource scarcity, and what that might mean, in order to result in this entrenchment of nativism or keeping something for oneself, even if that something has already been stolen from indigenous populations. And if we think about this kind of notorious question of where are you really from in that context, I think it becomes clearer how we might unpack why that question can be so problematic, even if it feels kind of innocent or curious. Because for one, it's making a choice for the recipient about how they choose to identify, when that is a complicated question oftentimes. It's suggesting a potential evaluation of ties to countries other than the United States, whether that be something that one should hide, whether that be something that can be easily exoticized. And it's also assuming that that question is simple. And I wanted to highlight a final text in Speak Okinawa, which is a new memoir by Elizabeth Miki-Brina, because of the way that it articulates the lack of simplicity around that question oftentimes. And I mentioned that Okinawa is a southern island of Japan, but perhaps it's more accurate to say that it is a colonized space subject to colonization throughout the last couple hundred years from China and from Japan and from the United States, with its own indigenous populations who do not identify as Japanese, even as Japan claims it as part of its landmass. And so this memoir is about a kind of second generation mixed race young woman whose Okinawan mother becomes Japanese in the context of living in the United States, and in fact becomes just generically Asian in the context of living in a mostly white neighborhood in New Jersey. And the writer's mixed race identity and her identification with both the colonized and the colonizer, and the multiple layers of displacement that exist within that identity because of her inability to speak to her mother's Okinawan relatives, not even in their native tongue, but in the tongue of the Japanese colonizer. And so my goal for this presentation was really to offer some different ways of thinking about rootedness and thinking about migratory flows and the perspectives that might help break down some of the matter of course assumptions that can make these kind of discussions of seemingly simple but very complicated issues more palpable. And so I look forward to hearing how you'd bring your own professional experience to the classroom and applying some of these different frames of perspective. Thank you so much for your time in this presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Professor Kennedy, for really such a nuanced look at the sort of ebbs and flows of migration in relation to the Japanese diaspora, whether that's in relation to the US or otherwise, right? And also just highlighting the nuance of identity and power dynamics and sort of the contentions that can go along with that. I think that's a really important point as well. Again, here we'll like to invite audience questions or any comments you might have for Professor Kennedy. That can be raising your hand and unmuting yourself, or if you prefer, you can type that in the chat as well. I guess while we're waiting for people to collect their thoughts, I was curious about your use of the museums as case studies. I know in terms of your own curation as well, I was curious if you could share your thoughts on using these museums as sort of like a pedagogical tool or an outreach tool, and how your thoughts on the Yokohama Museum and the LA Museum kind of informed your own curation of Exile to Motown, if you could speak on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things I could say in response to that. I think one of the first that comes to mind is the presentation that the Museum of Overseas Migration in Yokohama often gives to kind of the Japanese diasporic audiences as part of this program, because they have a separate presentation in addition to their exhibits that begins with this photograph of a Japanese American wedding where the bride is dressed in a kimono and the groom is dressed in a tuxedo. And the introduction to this image is like, isn't this strange? Look at them mixing it up, doing this sort of multicultural thing. And it's really funny because it's meant to be this moment of shock, but it doesn't tend to register in that way because it feels so natural to a Japanese American, for instance, audience to be participating in this mixed culture in that way. And this is not to say that Japanese weddings tend to always be Japanese traditional weddings either. They have many Western weddings, but I think it's the idea of this mixing that feels so strange and novel. And the way that highlights the different perspectives one might get from looking at a story from different national lenses, and the ways that there are many similarities between the immigration narratives offered in JANM and in the Museum of Overseas Migration. The two images I showed had piles of suitcases as the opening exhibit in both museums. But also the ways that those stories then begin to diverge. And I think the power of being able to see that is something that was influential in terms of thinking about how we then wanted to present the story of Japanese American community in Metro Detroit, because it's something that does not spring first to mind for, I think, anyone when they're like, oh yes, the history of Detroit, Japanese Americans, obviously. Or even, oh, the history of Japanese Americans. Clearly, we should be talking about Detroit. And I think being able to highlight the fact that that's not the expectation for your viewers can be really powerful, and then thinking about how they will then engage with the rest of the exhibit. So for our most recent version of this exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum, we were really interested in bridging this history of specifically Japanese American community with its relationship to these larger histories of Detroit, particularly with regard to race and industry. And so we have this 54-foot long timeline that has centrally the history of Japanese Americans in Metro Detroit, but is bookended at the top and bottom with the histories of this Metro Detroit area and the city of Detroit, as well as the national histories of Japanese America and Asian America, and being able to think about these things in concert, whether that be the removal of indigenous peoples from Detroit for the building of the city, whether that be Detroit and its participation in the Fugitive Slave Act, for instance, or its removals of Black populations from Black Bottom, as well as Japanese American, and its relationship to the McCarran-Walter Act, like I mentioned, or its relationship to anti-Asian violence in the beginning of the 19th and 20th, or the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries in Los Angeles and Colorado, in the ways that that might play into receptions also in the Midwest, and being able to think about these things in concert with each other and to see the ways that they are really kind of inextricable from one another in ways one might not expect when thinking about these seemingly unrelated histories.
Yeah, and
Mika.
I think go ahead, Carol.
Quick question. This is a permanent exhibit, right, at the Detroit Historical Museum?
It is actually not. It was an exhibit in summer and fall of this year in their community gallery, and is currently actually sitting in my living room in boxes. But we are hoping to show it in the future at the Henry Ford and perhaps at MSU if they have space for it, but they've expressed interest as well. So hopefully it will also be available to see elsewhere.
Great. We have more ideas on that. And just one quick mention that Speak Okinawa is one of the books that we will be providing in the book bag for all the participating teachers.
Aaron Connors in the chat says, I also work at the Henry Ford and would love to see it there. So that's great. Yeah, and one takeaway I also got from your presentation is a lot of people don't really realize how recent history a lot of this, like the exclusions of immigration and the incarceration, is also very recent history. And I think having these curations of museums kind of brings that to the forefront a bit, where you see these exhibits and you see these objects from these people's lives, and it kind of brings home that these things aren't some distant past. It's something that people are still currently grappling with now, and I think that's a really important point as well. So we have probably about time for one question before we move on to our next section. So if anybody has a comment or a question about anything, now would be the time to do so. It looks like Darby, are you unmuting?
Yeah, hi.
Awesome, great, go ahead.
Hi, Mika. Great discussion, thank you. So much great stuff and resources too. I've been thinking about the museum stuff quite a bit lately because I do some volunteering with the Portland Chinatown Museum. And there's a Japanese American museum just a few blocks away also. And so I guess I was curious, have you seen much collaboration between some of the Japanese American museums and other museums?
Yeah, I think I'm based in Michigan, and I think the most prominent one is really between the Japanese American National Museum and the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. When the Arab American National Museum was being established and being built, they relied heavily on kind of conversations and support from the Japanese American National Museum. And I think that's particularly important in the context of Metro Detroit, because Dearborn is the location of the highest population of Arab Americans in the United States, and also because the history of Japanese Americans and Arab and Muslim Americans intertwines so intensely with respect to 9/11 and the potential of a Muslim registry, the potential of racial profiling on the basis of this enemy threat similar to World War II. and the power of executive orders in being able to carry out these actions, both immediately after 9/11, as well as kind of more contemporaneously with regard to the Muslim ban. And where that history, I think, really shows itself is former Senator Norman Mineta, who was one of the major voices who refused to allow the US government at that time to profile Muslim and Arab Americans because of his own family's experience as a Japanese American who was incarcerated during World War II. And being able to carry that relationality and that kind of pan-ethnic solidarity into the contemporary moment has been a key point within these two museums, but also in terms of these communities broadly writ. So there's been a decent amount of collaboration between the museums and between the Arab American National Museum and the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit recently. So thanks so much for that question.
Glad to hear.
Okay, great. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next section, but please feel free to grab any threads from this discussion and bring them back into the afternoon session later. But for now, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who's going to introduce our final speaker.
Yes, thank you so much, Mika, for such a great presentation. I really appreciate all of the mentions of Michigan and what we can do here in our location to learn more about Japan and Japanese migrants and such. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Yoonjeong McClean. Dr. McClean is the Korea Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Michigan's Nam Center for Korean Studies. She is a sociologist whose research focuses on international and forced migration, law and society, political sociology, and Asian/Asian American studies. In her book project, she examines state and societal responses to asylum claims and refugee inflows, focusing primarily on South Korea. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McClean.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that wonderful introduction. Let me share my screen with you guys. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So as I was preparing for today's talk, I wanted to know what the world was Googling about South Korea. So I looked up South Korea's related search terms on Google Trends. And interestingly, the first related search term was squid, most likely because of the popular Netflix show, perhaps, Squid Game, directed and produced in South Korea. Well, today I'm not going to be talking about Squid Game, but instead direct my attention to some of the most requested topics by the participants of the workshop today, which was shared with me and the two other speakers a few weeks back. So first, I'll begin with a brief introduction of South Korea, providing basic geographic, demographic, economic, and political facts about the country. I will then move on to talk about theories of international migration as they relate to the history of Korean immigration to the United States. And then I'll move on to talk specifically about history of Korean immigration to the United States, as I have divided them into three different periods: the old period, the intermediate period, and the contemporary period. And lastly, I will end my presentation with the discussion of the model minority myth as one of the issues facing Korean/Asian American students today. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce the Republic of Korea, or also known as South Korea. It's a relatively small country that's located between China and Japan. That's about 40% of the size of the state of Michigan. The population of South Korea is about 52 million as of 2021, which is more than 5 times the population of Michigan. It is one of the richest countries in the world, ranking 10th in nominal GDP. And as many of you may already know, the Korean economy has not always been like this. And in fact, South Korea is notable for its dramatic economic development from one of the poorest countries in the world in the 50s and 60s, following the aftermath of the Korean Civil War, to a developed country in just over a few generations. The government of South Korea is a democratic republic, and South Korea is a liberal state committed to democratic and constitutional order. And according to this flagship annual report of Freedom House, which is a nonprofit organization that conducts research and advocacy on democracy, South Korea is labeled as free in political rights and civil liberties with an aggregate score of 83 out of 100. So for comparison, the US also scored 83 and in the same study. And I think some of the Nordic countries, Norway for sure, scored 100 in the same study. And lastly, South Korea borders North Korea, which by the way scored 3 in the Freedom House Index. South Korea and North Korea are demarcated by the heavily fortified demilitarized zone, or DMZ, since the ceasefire of the Korean War in 1953. So the history of Korean immigration is not isolated from the domestic history of Korea or the history of US immigration. And I think Mika laid out the laws that relate to US immigration history very well, and I think my presentation will complement well with hers. So in fact, the history of Korean immigration to the US, the domestic history of Korea, as well as US immigration history, they're all very tightly connected and transnational. So as I'll explain, the modern domestic history of Korea, including the colonial period under Japan, 1910 to 1945, Korean War and the US involvement in it from 1950 to 1953, and the following military dictatorship in the 60s and 80s, and the rapid economic development that followed, they all have facilitated Korean immigration to the US. And similarly, various immigration policy decisions, some of which were introduced in the previous presentation, they all have also facilitated Korean immigration or immigration at large to the United States. So I just want to say that the act of immigration is often incorrectly conceptualized entirely as an individual or agentic choice by the people who move, so the migrants themselves. But what I want to emphasize today and throughout this presentation is that this cannot be further from the reality. Of course, individual motivations play a critical role. However, there are other structural push-pull factors of migration which provide us more comprehensive answers to the question why certain groups of migrants move. And to clarify, and as you can guess from the context, the push factors refer to the reasons that motivate or encourage people to emigrate, to leave their countries of origin, while pull factors refer to the reasons that draw or attract migrants to immigrate. So there are a myriad of push-pull factors at work for any individual migrant or groups of migrants. But a satisfactory sociological theory account of international migration contains at least 4 elements. So the first one is the structural forces that promote emigration. So these are structural push forces. Structural forces that attract immigration. These are pull forces. The motivations, goals, and aspirations of the people who respond to these structural forces by becoming international migrants. So you can characterize these as individual motivations. And lastly, social and economic structures that rise to connect areas of out and in migration. So these include some of the social networks or linkages that people who move build, like family connections, marriage, and etc. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll go over the history of Korean immigration to the United States as I draw from these theoretical accounts and match Korean immigration history to the theoretical accounts of migration. So we can roughly divide up the history of Korean immigration to the United States into 3 phases. The old period from 1903 to 1949, involving a relatively small number of migrants. The intermediate period from 1950 to 1964, 1965, that consisted mainly of Korean citizens linked to Americans in one way or another following the Korean War. And the contemporary period starting in 1965, when the US abolished its the infamous federal quota system that had restricted people from outside the Western Europe from immigrating to the United States. So the first group of Korean immigrants, about 7,200 of them, arrived in Hawaii in the early 20th century to work as farmers on pineapple and sugar plantations. So most of the immigrants who first arrived were single men in their 20s and 30s who were driven by the promise of better economic earnings that they could either remit home or use to cultivate a better life. And from the demand side, the plantation owners in Hawaii were looking for cheap labor after Hawaii became a territory of the United States in 1900. 2 of the next significant groups of Korean immigrants who landed in the US during this old period were first Korean picture brides, young female migrants in their teens and early 20s who immigrated to the country to marry Korean bachelors who had arrived earlier, and political refugees and students who were involved in anti-Japanese independence movement. And as you can see on the left of the picture, I think it really captures the moment of first migratory journey to the United States as first generation migrants await for the ship to take them to sugar plantations in Hawaii. And actually, there is a really great museum of emigration in Incheon, which was the port that the first generation migrants departed. So if you ever get a chance to visit the city, I highly recommend visiting the museum. Incheon is incidentally where the airport is located, so I highly recommend it. So going back to the political refugees, so as many of you may be familiar, Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan in 1910 and was made a colony of Japan until 1945, when Japan was defeated in the Asia-Pacific War. The Korean political refugees and students who were in the US during this time worked towards Korea's independence movement from abroad. So they were first of the transnational activists, if you will. And many studied in the East Coast at universities like NYU, Columbia, and Princeton, and eventually returned to Korea after Korea won its independence to assume leadership roles. It's also worth mentioning here that Korean and other Asian immigrants to the US halted almost completely in 1924 when the US Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the National Origins Act, which effectively banned all Asian immigration to the United States, except for the Philippines, which was the US colony at the time. So let's kind of go back to the theories of international migration that I had discussed earlier. So as you can see, there was a structural push force of emigration, which was Japanese colonial rule, that resulted in political and social uncertainty. The pull factors were Hawaii plantation owners looking for cheap labor, and US Immigration Act of 1924, which kind of obliterated those pull forces, individual motivations, better economic life, and social and economic connections, marriage for the picture brides. So the intermediate period is the second wave of immigration from Korea. It occurred in the decade following the Korean War. And during this period, approximately 15,000 Koreans immigrated to the United States. And the Korean War had a significant impact on Korean immigration to the US. So in 1948, that's at the dawn of the Cold War, and 3 years after the independence from Japan, Korea was divided into two zones of sovereign occupation. The Republic of Korea, or South Korea, supported by the US, and Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, supported by the Soviet Union. So during the pre and post-Korean War and throughout the Cold War, really, the US was deeply involved in South Korea's political and economic development, one result of which was specific groups of Korean citizens migrating to the United States. The three groups of Korean immigrants during this time were first Korean wives of US servicemen who were stationed in Korea and returned. And these women were, they're known as war brides. Second group was the Korean War orphans, right? They're adopted by American families. Many of them were called GI babies, or mixed race children from Korean mothers and US soldiers, the babies who were abandoned in the aftermath of the war. And the third group is the Korean international students, mostly men from wealthy families who received education in the United States. So again, going back to our chart, if the structural push factors for emigration were related to the Korean War, the structural pull factors included relevant US legislations like the War Bride Act of 1945 that allowed alien spouses, natural children, and adopted children of members of the US Armed Forces, and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which got rid of the previous ban on Asian immigration while still maintaining a very conservative national origins quotas, as well as the familial and social linkages that and networks that were developed during the Korean War. Lastly, the third and by far the largest wave of Korean immigration to the US was made possible by the historic 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which basically revoked the previous de facto discriminatory and racist national quota system that had barred Asian immigration. So as you can see in this picture, President Johnson is signing the immigration bill of 1965, suitably at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. So let's revisit our chart here. So if the US Immigration Act of 1965 was the structural pull factor, some of the major structural push factors, especially between 1965 and 1990, were the relatively low standard of living in Korea and political insecurity that arose from Korea's military dictatorship and authoritarian rule. Many are actually surprised to find out that Korea's first official democratic government was instituted only in 1988, the same year that the Seoul Olympics took place, which is an event that really elevated Korea's reputation in the international community. So going back to the previous slide, so this third wave of Korean immigrants differed significantly from the first two waves in that they were often college educated and brought families with them when they immigrated. Despite their relatively highly educated status, though, most post-1965 Korean immigrants were not able to get white-collar jobs in the US due to their lack of English skills and cultural competency, which in turn kind of facilitated them to work as small businesses or some were small business owners, like at greengroceries, laundromats, nail salons, etc. The children of the first generation Korean immigrants, however, they display a different life path than their parents. So the children are called second generation or 1.5 generation if they came to the United States when they were young. And second generation refers to the children of first generation who were born in the United States. So the children, they tend to be more educated than their parents, have higher annual income, and work as professionals and managers than as self-employed small business workers. And according to this research done by a sociologist named Chang-Hwan Kim at the University of Kansas, the second generation Korean Americans are not only more, quote, successful than the first generation Korean immigrants, but are substantially more successful than other second generation racial groups in the US. So they are more educated than native born non-Hispanic whites, Blacks, and Hispanics, earn more than whites, and are the third highest income earners among Asian ethnic groups after Indian Americans and Chinese Americans. Perhaps because of the perception that Asian Americans have somehow like made it in the United States, they have been labeled as model minority, the minority that's hardworking, educated, submissive, law-abiding, etc. And the picture that you see here is at the Time magazine cover on Asian American whiz kids that was published in 1987, which kind of captures this popular imagery of model minority. And I asked the conference organizers to circulate a short Washington Post article that problematizes this label. So I hope you get a chance to read it if you haven't done so already. The reason why I decided to kind of end the presentation by introducing this concept of model minority as one of the issues that may face Asian American students today, it really arises from my own personal experience growing up in Virginia as a student whose inadvertent embodiment of the model minority stereotype caused a lot of stress. And I think many of your students may be able to sympathize with the sentiment that I had felt when I was a student growing up in the US. So I have a short YouTube video here that I'd like to show. I know we're running out of time, so I'm gonna just show the first 4 or 5 minutes or so, but please feel free to finish it on your own. I found this video, it's a Good Morning America video on model minority, and I think it explains it comprehensively. So let me play it.
Have you ever heard these stereotypes about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders?
Wow, baby, me so horny.
We are naturally good at math.
Come on, do math.
We are submissive.
We give you top secret at the massage.
How did Ryan use it as an object?
As an object.
Ryan used me as an object.
As women, we're exotic. As men, desexualized and passive.
What's happening, hot stuff?
Or that we all look the same.
Sorry, man. Oh, y'all look alike.
And I've heard all my life that we must be wealthy. Yeah, right. But here's the thing. We're not all crazy rich Asians. So where do these stereotypes come from? To start, like many stereotypes about one group, they aren't true, and it's difficult to trace their origins. There's another stereotype about the AAPI community you may have heard of. It's called the model minority myth. It claims we are the best minority, the hardest working group in the country, and the one that causes the least trouble in America. The myth may seem somewhat complimentary. For the longest time growing up, I used it as a crutch so others would think highly of me. But now as an adult, I don't take it as a compliment. One of the most harmful parts of the myth is that it portrays us as well-behaved outsiders, to follow all of the rules, which can ultimately lead to a comparison to other ethnic minorities in America, whose own wrongfully placed stereotypes differ from ours. Unlike most stereotypes, we might know how the false model minority myth began. Some scholars suggest the model minority myth was sparked by sociologist William Peterson in 1966, when he wrote an article for the New York Times magazine called Success Story, Japanese American Style. He said in part, the Japanese Americans are better than any other group in our society, including native-born white. They have established this remarkable record, moreover, by their own almost totally unaided effort. Every attempt to hamper their progress resulted only in enhancing their determination to succeed. There is no parallel to this success story. By essentializing Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as the model minority, it's like we're saying we're born with it and other people aren't. So if we believe the model minority myth to be true, that means people could think other groups could be born with their own myths as well, right? This concept has driven a wedge between the AAPI community and the other diverse groups in America. Let's hear from Claire Jean Kim, professor at the University of California, Irvine, who is an expert on the history of Asian Americans.
What this set of ideas does is it says that Asians succeed because of something they have inside of them, and other minorities don't have that. The model minority idea is a way for white people and the mainstream society to say back to the Black freedom movement, well, actually, some people succeed. It's just you're not succeeding because you lack these values.
No one is born a stereotype. By relying on stereotypes to explain people's predicaments, we let the system around us off the hook. And maybe it's the system itself that's reinforcing these stereotypes that hurt people of color every day.
So I'm going to end the clip here. I'm afraid we don't have enough time, but thank you so much for being great participants in the workshop and in this presentation. And I hope I was able to convey through this presentation that history of Asian Americans cannot be separated from history of US policy decision-making vis-a-vis immigration, and also the history of Asian countries. They're very tightly linked. It's still, the discipline is still very much divided, right? Asian studies and Asian American studies are conceptualized differently in a lot of the institutions, and it's understandable. However, I think through the lens of international migration, we can see that they are very tightly interlinked. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Angela. Yeah, briefly, while people are, mulling over your wonderful presentation, I'll let people, please feel free to raise your hand or enter your questions or comments into the chat. And I just like to react to that video at the end. I just thought it was a very succinct explanation of the model minority myth and how not only it hurts the AAPI community within itself, as it is such a large umbrella, but it also hurts other minorities in the United States. And I think that something that I was wondering, what are your thoughts, Angela, of what we can do in terms of the model minority myth so that it can't be used as a weapon to divide communities, whether that's within the AAPI community or against other minorities in the US?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. We cannot stop stereotypes from spreading, right? They are entrenched not just in our popular culture, but also, in our daily lives and in our communications with not just our friends and peers and colleagues, but also with strangers as well, right? So I think as educators, what we can do is, kind of treat Asian American students not differently from other minority groups of students, right? I think that's the first to go to answer. Treat them as individuals and not as a part of a group stereotype. It is very hard to do because it's heavily ingrained in our everyday practice, right? And you see it so often, it's so prevalent. But I think it's important to pay conscious attention when interacting with our students, that we as educators don't kind of embroil ourselves in what larger society is, has been telling us to do.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, Yanshuo, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Angela. That was a wonderful presentation with a lot of great insights. I just wanted to echo what you said earlier about the fact that those stereotypes actually don't just hurt other racial and ethnic minority groups in the US, but the modern minority myth could also hurt Asian students and people themselves. I remember, having conversations with students, second generation Asian students, who said, oh, because most Asians are perceived to be good at math, and we are almost always expected to major in STEM fields. So that makes a lot of Asian students feel bad about straying from STEM fields, right? What if they love literature? What if they love arts? And then they're like, oh no, but my parents and everybody else would think that I would be an anomaly. So those myths are really restricting to Asian students as well, because they're put into those wrongly conceived ideological and cultural confines, which ultimately would do Asian students a disservice, or Asian American students a disservice. So they couldn't really, achieve that full personal potential. So I think, yeah, it's important to demystify those stereotypes and think about what alternative ways we could come up with in terms of enforcing the diversity within Asian American communities. And I think in my past experience, I've heard of people talking about, whenever we talk about Asians, in addition to talking about science and technology, can we use the example of Asian artists, Asian actors, and who are good at non-science, non-technology fields to really enrich the image of Asian people here in the US. So I just wanted to share that thought.
Absolutely. And I think perhaps it's in the video, or I read it somewhere, that the first cause of death for Asian American students between the ages of 15 and 24 is suicide. And I think there are research that shows that this kind of pressure that's put upon them may be the cause of that. And so I think you're absolutely right. It affects Asian American students. It kind of, covers their unique individual stories under this one big stereotypical umbrella, and it causes a lot of mental stress for Asian American students. And this is also coming from my own experience, as well as some of my Asian American peers as well. So you're absolutely right. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you both, Yanshuo and Angela, for sharing your personal experiences. We really appreciate your vulnerability in this space. And I also just want to let everyone know that Erin Connors, one of our educators here today, has also shared something in the chat. Erin, feel free to unmute your mic and turn on your camera if you'd prefer to speak yourself. But if not, oh, thank you, Erin. I see that you're coming on.
Yeah, I teach in Dearborn, and I teach at the high school, one of the high schools that has the largest population of Middle Eastern Muslims in our state. And we have a very large group of parents and families that really push the doctor, nurse, pharmacist, engineer, high-paying job roles for their students. And like, I've had students that are like, well, I want to, I kind of love being in art classes, and I love these things, but my family really wants me to go this route with being a doctor. And there's also an unrealistic expectation. Like, sometimes the student, one, doesn't like the field, but two, isn't going to do well in that field. And so Dearborn has adopted an academy model that talks about other types of careers you can have, and it doesn't necessarily involve going directly to college. And it's been interesting to see that we're trying to shift the mindset that not everyone needs to be in these high-paying jobs, and families are just still really, they want their children to do better than they did, right? And that's part of that. And they want to be able to say that they can give back to the community, they can do these things, and having a good financial status does that for them. So it's an interesting thing, and we're seeing it with our students as well. It's not necessarily from the same background that, you know, they should go into STEM because they're good at math or anything like that. It is a different reasoning behind it, but we're seeing a very similar narrative at our schools too. So thank you for sharing your experiences. It is not, I don't want to say comparable, but it's definitely, I can relate to what you're saying because of what we're seeing as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your experience, Erin.
Yeah, and it looks like Darby, would you like to unmute and share your experience as well?
I want to thank you all for raising the model and minority issue. And since we're looking for more educational resources also, I want to put a plug in for a documentary I produced called Model and Minority, Do the Math. So if you type that into Google, you would come up with something. It's actually available for screening on Vimeo. I'm a co-producer. The other co-producer is in Boston, and we're both available for using it for educational purposes and presentations too. Or you can contact me directly if you want me to send you a link.
Darby, I was going to say, put it in the chat right now.
Oh, okay, why don't I see if I can pull that off?
Okay.
Yeah, that's another thing, everyone who's here today, if you have any kind of resources that you've created yourself or that your schools have created that is allowed to be shared, please do feel free to share it in the chat with everyone else today throughout the rest of the workshop. So unfortunately, we are out of time for Q&A. So oh, actually, wait. Oh, it looks like Gabrielle has raised her hand though. So why don't we let Gabrielle share your thoughts? Oh, actually, no. Maybe it was an accident. Okay, that's all right. So I will go ahead and thank Dr. McClean one last time for your presentation today. And thank you to our speakers this morning. And then I just want to invite my colleague Carol back to the mic to close us out before lunch.
Thank you. I echo your sentiment, Kate. Thank you to our speakers for really stimulating talks and great conversation. And we really hope these morning talks provide ways to amplify some of the key cases and history books and open students' eyes to the range of stories with emigration, immigration, and migration. And after lunch, we have a really interesting session that will reflect on your teaching and your own learning and experiences. But what I'd like to do right now, just take a minute to introduce one of a special guest as well, the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center, Ann Lin, who's professor of policy at the U of M Ford School of Public Policy. She's a political scientist who focuses on immigration studies, social policy, and prejudice, and moderated a version of this very topic just a couple of days ago at the university. And she has a great email signature with this wonderful quote: "I want you to listen with an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out." Sarah Maitland, a British novelist. And so, Professor Lin, please.
Thank you so much, Carol. And thank you to the other organizers, Klemm-Szeto and Robin Griffin, and to just the great speakers that we've had today, Mika Kennedy, Yanshuo Zhang, Angela McClean. Just really a really exciting, stimulating first morning session. As Carol said, the migration is an area of my interest in research. And one of the things that I was thinking about when we listened to as I was listening to the presentations and the discussion afterwards is how much we should be thinking about these new resources, these resources for Asian American history, as resources, not just for our Asian American students, but really for everybody. I remember when I was a first generation American kid growing up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, we did not have a ton of immigrants around. We certainly didn't have courses on Asian American history or even immigrant history. But I got a lot of joy out of reading the All of One Kind series by Sidney Taylor, which is about Jewish immigrants in the early, in the beginning of the 20th century. And their background couldn't be more different than mine. The place we were living couldn't be more different. I was in the suburbs, they were in the city, et cetera, et cetera. But there were things about that sort of immigrant experience that really made sense to me. And so one of the things, and I think our discussion has really brought it out, one of the wonderful things about introducing these kinds of resources to your students is they won't only appeal to the people they're quote unquote, should appeal to or belong to. They can really, learning about the model minority myth, inspired Erin to talk about her Middle Eastern students. And no, it's not exactly the same, but you can see a lot of ways in which that intersects. I think learning about the history of or the experience of Chinese students coming to the U.S. The U.S. is a real home for all sorts of international students, of course, from all sorts of countries. And again, you never know where that's going to make sense to your students. You never know how that's going to click into somebody's experience. So all I want to say is thank you so much for putting together this great workshop. I'm really looking forward to the discussion and really looking forward to, our efforts together, to make the history of America, more rich, more complex, more sort of filled with different ways in which we can all link into our different identities. Thank you.